The Texas sun was sinking behind the skyline of Dallas, painting the city in hues of amber and gold. The air was thick with the familiar sounds of rush hour. Distant honks, tires rolling over asphalt, the occasional roar of a motorcycle speeding past. Inside his sedan, Nathan Carter drove in silence, his fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel. After a long day at the Dallas Police Department's Internal Affairs Division, he was looking forward to nothing more than a quiet evening at home. The soft hum of jazz played from the radio, a welcome contrast to the noise outside. He exhaled slowly, adjusting the air conditioning, letting the cool air wash over him as he approached a busy intersection. The traffic light shifted from yellow to red. He eased onto the brake, coming to a stop just as the light changed. Then, the flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror. The piercing wail of a siren. Nathan's grip on the wheel tightened, his eyes flicked to the mirror, watching as a Dallas patrol cruiser pulled up behind him, its headlights flooding his cabin with an unrelenting glare. He sighed. A routine stop, perhaps. Maybe a misunderstanding. But he knew better than to assume it would be just that. With practiced calm, he flipped on his turn signal and pulled to the side of the road, rolling down his window as he watched the officer's silhouette step out of the cruiser. A slow inhale, a steady exhale. This was not going to be just another traffic stop. Nathan Carter kept his hands on the wheel, his movements deliberate, controlled. He had been in situations like this before, not as a driver, but as an investigator, dissecting incidents just like this from behind his desk at Internal Affairs. The crunch of boots on pavement grew closer. Through the side mirror, he saw the officer approaching. Officer Damian Reed. Mid-30s, sharp jawline, buzzed hair, and a badge gleaming under the streetlights. His posture radiated confidence, the kind of swagger that came from years of believing he was always in control. "License and registration," Reed demanded, his voice flat but edged with authority. Nathan nodded, moving with steady precision, no sudden movements. He retrieved his wallet from the center console, then reached for the registration in the glove compartment. He handed them over, his face unreadable, his breathing even. Reed took the documents but didn't look at them right away. Instead, he lingered, scanning Nathan's face as if searching for something more than a simple traffic violation. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" Nathan met his gaze, calm and direct. "I assume it's a traffic matter." "You rolled through that red light," Reed said, though his tone lacked conviction. Nathan frowned slightly but remained composed. "I thought I slowed down in time, but if I misjudged, I understand." Reed didn't respond right away. He studied the license now, his eyes narrowing. "You're not from around here, are you?" Nathan hesitated for a fraction of a second. A strange question, and one that had nothing to do with a traffic stop. "Moved here a few months ago," Nathan replied evenly. "My address is on the license." But Reed wasn't really listening. His questions weren't about a red light anymore. "Where were you headed in such a hurry?" Nathan noted the shift in tone. This wasn't just a routine stop. It was something more. "Just going home," he answered. Reed took a step closer, the streetlights casting long shadows over his face. "Mind stepping out of the car for me?" Nathan's grip on the steering wheel tightened for a moment, but his expression remained neutral. "Is there a reason for that, officer?" A flicker of something passed through Reed's eyes. Irritation, perhaps. "I ask you to step out of the car. You don't want to make this harder than it has to be." The unspoken threat hung between them. Nathan exhaled slowly, keeping his movements precise as he unlocked the door and stepped out onto the pavement. As he did, he could feel it. The shift in power. The weight of assumptions pressing down. This was no longer about a red light. This was about something else entirely. Nathan Carter stood beside his sedan, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his posture calm yet unyielding. The air was thick with the hume of passing traffic, But in this moment, the world had shrunk down to just him and Officer Damian Reed. Reed took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning Nathan from head to toe. The tailored dress shirt, the polished shoes, the professional demeanor. None of it seemed to matter. Reed wasn't seeing a man who had simply run a red light. He was seeing something else. "Hands where I can see them," Reed ordered, his voice clipped. Nathan complied without hesitation, raising his palms slightly. "Is there something specific you're looking for, officer?" His tone was measured, devoid of challenge, yet Reed's expression hardened. "Just routine," Reed replied, though there was an unmistakable edge in his voice. "We've had some incidents in the area, you can never be too careful." Nathan tilted his head slightly, locking eyes with him. "Incidents involving men in business attire driving sedans? Or does this have to do with something else?" The question landed like a punch. For a moment, Reed's confidence wavered, his jaw tensed, his fingers tapping lightly against the radio at his shoulder. "Watch your tone," he snapped. "I'm just doing my job." Nathan didn't flinch. "I understand that, officer. I just believe in transparency when it comes to these interactions. You pulled me over for a red light and now we're here. So, I have to ask, what exactly are you looking for?" Reed took another step, closing the distance between them. His stance was different now, more confrontational, as if Nathan's calm demeanor was starting to wear on him. "You seem pretty comfortable with how this works," Reed muttered, his eyes narrowing. "You got something to hide?" Nathan let the silence stretch for a beat before replying, "No, officer, but I believe in knowing my rights." Reed scoffed but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he paced a slow circle in front of the car, his hand drifting toward his belt, not quite reaching for his weapon, but close enough to send a message. Nathan remained still, unbothered. He had seen this play out too many times before. It wasn't about law enforcement. It was about control. And Officer Reed didn't like that he wasn't the one holding it. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Reed finally ordered, his voice cold. Nathan exhaled slowly. He could feel the shift, the moment when a simple stop had turned into something more. This wasn't about the law anymore. This was about power. Nathan Carter stood motionless, the cool evening air brushing against his skin as Officer Damian Reed took another step closer. The quiet tension between them had thickened, turning the street into an invisible battlefield. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood," Reed repeated, his voice edged with impatience. Nathan didn't move right away. Instead, he held Reed's gaze, searching for something. Reason, logic, justification. He found none. "Officer, do you have probable cause for a search?" Nathan asked, his voice even, controlled. Reed's jaw tightened. "I don't need to explain myself to you." But he did. And he knew it. Nathan exhaled through his nose, his patience wearing thin. "You stopped me for a traffic violation. Now you're treating me like a suspect. Why?" Reed's hand twitched near his belt, a reflexive show of dominance. "Because I said so." That was it. That was the line. The moment when professionalism crumbled, replaced by raw authority. The kind of authority that didn't need to be justified, just obeyed. Nathan knew this tactic well. He had seen it play out in countless cases sitting behind his desk at Internal Affairs. But this time, he wasn't reviewing the footage. He was living it. Slowly, deliberately, he turned, placing his palms flat against the hood of his car. The metal was warm from the day's lingering heat. Reed stepped in, his movements sharp and forceful. His hands moved over Nathan's torso, then down his legs. A search meant not just to check for weapons, but to remind Nathan who was in control. Except Nathan wasn't reacting the way most people would. He wasn't flinching, he wasn't protesting, he wasn't afraid. That unsettled Reed. The officer stepped back, frustration flickering across his face. "You're clean," he muttered, almost annoyed at the lack of justification for his actions. Nathan turned slowly, facing him once more. His expression remained unreadable, but his eyes burned with quiet authority. "Of course I am." Reed clenched his jaw. "You think you're smarter than me?" Nathan tilted his head slightly. "I think I know my rights." Silence stretched between them, the weight of the moment pressing down. Then Nathan took a single step forward, not aggressively, not defiantly, but with the kind of quiet confidence that made Reed shift his weight, suddenly unsure of where he stood. "Respect isn't about a badge, officer," Nathan said, his voice steady. "It's about how you choose to wear it." Reed's nostrils flared, his hands tightening into fists at his sides. He was losing control of the situation, and he knew it. But the real reckoning was yet to come. The silence between them stretched, thick and unyielding. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows across the pavement. Officer Damian Reed stood rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. This wasn't going the way he had expected. Nathan Carter adjusted the cuffs of his sleeves, the movement deliberate, unfazed. He wasn't rattled, he wasn't intimidated. And that made Reed uneasy. "You seem pretty confident," Reed muttered, almost to himself. "Like you think you know how this is going to play out." Nathan tilted his head slightly. "Confidence isn't the issue here, officer. Respect is." Reed scoffed, but it was weaker this time. His authority, once unquestioned, was slipping between his fingers like sand. He had encountered resistance before, people who stammered, pleaded, got defensive. But Nathan wasn't playing the role Reed expected. He stepped forward, closing the space between them, his voice dropping lower. "You got something to hide?" Nathan let the words settle for a moment before replying, "No, officer. But I think we both know you're looking for something that isn't there." Reed's jaw tensed. He had pushed and found nothing. And then Nathan reached into his pocket. Reed's hand immediately twitched toward his holster, his body going stiff. Nathan caught the movement and froze, his voice calm but firm. "I'm reaching for my badge." Reed's fingers hovered near his gun, his breath hitching for a fraction of a second before he hesitated. Nathan moved slowly, deliberately. He pulled out a leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing a gleaming badge. Dallas Police Department, Internal Affairs Division. Reed's face drained of color. Nathan held his gaze. "Nathan Carter," he said smoothly, as if he were introducing himself at a business meeting. "Chief Investigator, Internal Affairs." Reed's eyes darted from the badge to Nathan's face, searching for any sign that this was a joke, a bluff. But there was no humor in Nathan's expression. Just quiet authority. Just power. The kind that didn't need to shout to be heard. Reed took a small step back, suddenly aware of just how deep he had sunk. Nathan's voice remained steady. "You see, officer, this whole time you've assumed I was someone who wouldn't know my rights, who wouldn't understand the law you swore to uphold." A pause, a beat. "That was your mistake." The streetlights buzzed overhead. Reed's breathing was shallow. And for the first time tonight, he realized he had just made the worst mistake of his career. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of traffic, the distant murmur of the city, it all faded into the background. Officer Damian Reed stood frozen, his posture rigid, his mind racing. Everything had changed in an instant. Nathan Carter didn't move. He didn't need to. His badge spoke louder than any argument could. "Internal Affairs?" Reed finally muttered under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, realization settling into his bones. Nathan nodded. "That's right." Reed's fingers twitched at his sides, the weight of his badge suddenly feeling heavier than ever. He wasn't just facing a routine traffic stop anymore. He was standing before the man who held the power to decide his future. Nathan took a slow step forward, his voice even, unwavering. "You want to know the most concerning part of this interaction, officer?" Reed said nothing. He didn't trust himself to speak. "It's not just the profiling," Nathan continued. though that's bad enough. It's not even the unnecessary escalation. It's the fact that you did all of this without even knowing who I was." Reed clenched his jaw, his face tight with tension. Nathan's voice sharpened. "You assumed I wouldn't know my rights. You assumed I wouldn't push back. And if I weren't in this position, if I weren't internal affairs, this would have gone very differently, wouldn't it?" Reed exhaled through his nose, his eyes darting to the ground, to the patrol car, anywhere but at Nathan. Because he knew the answer. Nathan let the silence stretch, letting the weight of his words settle over Reed like a judgment. "This isn't just about you," Nathan said finally. "It's about every person you've stopped who didn't have a badge. Every person who didn't have the authority to question you. Every person who walked away from an interaction like this feeling powerless." Reed shifted his stance, his breathing shallow. Nathan studied him for a long moment before stepping back. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're going to hand me my documents. You're going to return to your vehicle, and you're going to think, really think, about what you say next." Reed hesitated, his lips parting as if to argue. But he caught himself. Slowly he reached into his chest pocket, pulling out Nathan's license and registration. His hands, steady earlier, now trembled slightly as he handed them back. Nathan took them without a word, slipping them back into his wallet. He turned toward his car, pausing with one hand on the door handle. "You'll be hearing from me again," Nathan added, looking over his shoulder. "Not as the driver you stopped tonight, but as the man who decides if you're still fit to wear that badge." Reed's face paled. Nathan slid into his seat, started the engine, and pulled away, leaving Reed standing alone under the harsh glow of the streetlights. But for Nathan, this wasn't over. One officer wasn't the problem. The system that allowed him to act this way was. And change was coming. Nathan Carter sat in his office the next morning, the early sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across his desk. The file in front of him bore a name he now knew too well, Officer Damian Reed. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled, deep in thought. Reed wasn't an outlier. He wasn't some rare bad apple in an otherwise perfect system. He was a symptom of something much larger, a culture that had been allowed to fester unchecked for too long. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Linda, his assistant, stepped in, a stack of reports balanced in her hands. "Morning, Mr. Carter. I've got the misconduct reports from last month," she said, placing them on his desk. "Also, Chief Bennett wanted me to remind you about next week's department review." Nathan nodded, flipping open Reed's file. The contents weren't surprising. Small complaints of unprofessional conduct, excessive stops, vague misunderstandings that had been swept under the rug. Nothing that had ever led to real consequences. Until now. "Thanks, Linda. Can you also set up a meeting with Chief Bennett this afternoon? There's something we need to discuss." Linda hesitated, sensing the weight in his tone. "Of course," she said, before slipping out. Nathan exhaled, his gaze settling back on the file. One officer wasn't the real problem. It was the system that had let him operate this way without accountability. That was about to change. That afternoon, Nathan sat across from Chief Bennett in a stark conference room, the tension between them as heavy as the subject at hand. Bennett, a seasoned veteran with salt and pepper hair and a no-nonsense demeanor, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed as he listened to Nathan's account of the traffic stop. When Nathan finished, Bennett sighed, rubbing his temples. "This isn't the first time Reed's name has come up," he admitted. "But we've always handled it internally, quietly." Nathan's expression didn't waver. "And that's the problem, Chief. Quiet doesn't fix anything. Quiet lets it keep happening." Bennett exhaled sharply. "So what are you proposing?" Nathan didn't hesitate. "A department-wide review, not just of individual officers, but of our training, our protocols, our accountability systems. We can't keep sweeping this under the rug. If we don't hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we expect the community to trust us?" Bennett was silent for a long moment, his fingers drumming against the table. Then, finally, he nodded. "You're going to ruffle some feathers with this." Nathan's lips twitched. Good. It's about time someone did. Months later, Nathan stood at the podium of a community event, addressing a room filled with officers, city officials, and residents. He didn't speak of blame, he spoke of responsibility, of the shared duty to create a system that worked for everyone. "Justice isn't just about catching the bad guys," Nathan said, his voice carrying through the hall. "It's about making sure the people sworn to protect and serve do so with integrity, fairness, and respect for everyone they encounter." The applause was thunderous, but Nathan didn't linger on it. For him, this wasn't the end of the story, it was the beginning of a better one. Power is not a privilege, it is a responsibility. Nathan Carter's story is not just about one officer's abuse of authority, it is about the culture that allows it to persist. It reminds us that justice isn't simply about punishing wrongdoing, but about ensuring accountability from those entrusted to uphold the law. For many, encounters like Nathan's don't end in a moment of reckoning. They end in silence, in fear, in resignation. But silence allows injustice to continue. It is only by speaking up, by demanding transparency and fairness, that real change begins. This story also teaches us that respect is not something granted by a badge or a title, it is earned through actions. True leadership, whether in law enforcement or in life, comes from integrity, not intimidation. For older generations who have witnessed decades of societal shifts, this lesson is especially poignant. Change is possible, but it requires courage. Courage to question, to hold accountable, and to build a system that serves everyone fairly. Justice should not depend on who holds the power, but on the principles that guide it. And that is a lesson worth passing on. Nathan Carter's story is a reminder that justice isn't just about enforcing laws. It's about upholding fairness, respect, and accountability. Real change starts when we refuse to stay silent. If this story resonated with you, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking stories about integrity, resilience, and the pursuit of justice.